We have 15 participants already, and I'll start now. And I expect that people will slowly be joining us as we go along. So hello everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. My name is Theodor Mladenov. I'm coordinating the Independent Living Research Network of the European Network of Independent Living. So let me first say a few words about the Independent Living Research Network, and then I will introduce our speakers today, and we will start our webinar. So this webinar is organized by the Independent Living Research Network, which has been set up by by the European Network on Independent Living in 2018, with the purpose of facilitating research on independent living. Since then, we have developed different activities, and we are now having a dedicated web page on the website. I will post the link in the chat so that people can see it. We maintain a reading list, independent living reading list that has been recently updated, and it's again available through the link in the chat. We also maintain a database of our members who are doing research on independent living. Currently, we have 38 researchers as members of the network from 17 different countries, most of them in Europe, but we also have members from other parts of the world as well. So we maintain a web page with our members' research interests and their key publications as well. All this is related to independent living and research on different aspects of independent living. And this webinar series are again part of the activities of our network, and we hope that we will be able to organize other webinars like this. We are planning to have one in the autumn of this year, in September or October, so watch this space. There are some housekeeping things to say for the participants, for our audience today. You can post your questions to our speakers in the chat box or in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand if you want to speak directly. We will have time for questions and comments after each of the two presentations that we will hear and see today. As a matter of courtesy, it would be good to avoid jargon and to keep your comments and questions short and to the point. There is also automated closed captioning that you can access through Zoom's features. In the Zoom menu, there is a button for closed captioning that you can activate. So, without further ado, I will now give the word to our first presenters for today. Agnes and Gabor, who have been doing research on disability and independent living for many, many years now, and have also been active in advocating for the rights of disabled people in Europe, particularly in the field of the institutionalization and intellectual disabilities. Agnes, Gabor, please feel free to take over. And after your presentation, we'll have some time for questions and comments, and then we will proceed to our second speaker for today, who is Miro Griffiths from the University of Leeds.
Thank you, Theo. Can everybody hear me? There's a lot of background noise. Okay, yep. Excellent. Thank you. So my name is Agnes and I was one of the researchers working on this multi-annual project funded by a Hungarian research council, and we are going to present some findings. Gabor, can you move to the next one? Thank you. So just briefly, a little bit about the context and about Hungary, if you like, and the situation in Hungary. As you will all know, Hungary is one of the post-socialist countries in Western Europe. As many of the other countries, it is characterized by kind of the medical productivist approach to disabilities. So disabled people kind of have access to segregated services in education, and there was particularly a strong reliance on large residential institutions and medicalized disability assessment and work assessment. After transition, there were some quite significant legal milestones and progress. Firstly, the Disability Rights Act that was enacted in 1998. This is largely similar to the Americans with Disabilities Act, discrimination, accessibility, and there was some sort of a mandate to the institutionalization. However, this was not really backed up by resources, so it was really kind of like a vague legislation. Then in 2007, Hungary was one of the first countries that ratified the UN Convention, but again, it was not really backed up by resources for implementation and the general consensus of where the country was heading. Also, 20 years ago, Hungary became an EU member state, and then from 2007, started accessing EU structural funds for investment into the infrastructure of public services, and from 2007, the institutionalization became one of the key kind of investment areas in social services. It's really, there's been an unprecedented amount of money that's gone into this. However, there is this ongoing contention. There is very little tangible results have been achieved in terms of progress towards supporting people to live independently in the community. So referring to Theo's and Gabor's work, the country or the whole kind of service landscape or the whole policy landscape is characterized by a maldistribution of resources, where institutions and institutional settings are very heavily subsidized and people get very limited support to live independently. And then again, all this has been ongoing in the context of austerity and neoliberal reforms. The financial crisis hit Hungary quite badly, so and there's been a review and reform of disability pension and benefits, with very heavy reliance on subsidizing employment without supporting people's access to the labor market. And another very important thing about Hungary is the kind of the gradual but recently more rapid erosion of democracy, and there is really this shrinking space for grassroots organizations, community organizations for real independent advocacy and involvement in policy and political activities. But this is a whole other story, and Gabor would tell you a lot more about that, but it's done some excellent work on this. So over to you, Gabor. I hope people could hear me because it's been really interesting.
Yes, we can hear you again.
Okay, so we decided to launch this research project because we felt that all this historical progress, all the changes that happened to Hungarian society and disabled people included in Hungarian society started in 1998 with the landmark Disability Rights Act. And we felt when we started the project that these 20 years were due a closer look to track how these changes played out in the lives of disabled people, with a focus on those mechanisms and dynamics that continue to marginalize disabled people. There was also a tension that we perceived between public data, available data, and the discourse, the public discourse that sees these 20 years as a period of progress on the one hand, and disabled people's own lived realities on the other hand. So our inquiry was partly also about clarifying what has happened and how we can even track changes and identify those barriers to independent living that persist and have persisted over these 20 years. We employed the research questions on the slide, and we were aware that our sample and our whole inquiry focuses on or brings together a very complex field with different disability groups with quite different needs. And given the time frame of our research, we started in 1998 with this landmark law, and our project was launched just before the COVID pandemic. So we were aware that both the time frame and the panorama view and the longitudinal view of our data provides us with a very complex data set that we need to analyze with employing different research methods. So accordingly, our research approach was very complex. Agi was very humble to herself because she said that she was just one of us. She was the lead researcher of the project. We worked with Tarki Research Institute, T-A-R-K-I. Their website is tarki.hu, who hosted our project. And we employed the following research methods. So we did a secondary analysis of literature and statistics. We started with interviewing stakeholders and senior experts in the field to better understand how they frame the history of the last 20 years, policy changes, laws, how they speak about all this period with all the massive changes that Agi mentioned in the first slide. The bulk of our research, and I should say also the bulk of our resources, were allocated to live course interviews with disabled people and their family members. Altogether, we conducted 93 live course interviews in the middle of the COVID pandemic, really. That's another issue we could explore because it was a very interesting experience and a challenge that we managed to overcome successfully. We employed thematic analysis for the analysis of these live course interviews. We also did a survey on stigma and attitude towards different groups of disabled people. I will speak about this later as well. We did a media analysis about media representations in the mainstream media, about disabled people, disability organizations, disability rights. And we completed the study with focus groups involving different stakeholders, including disabled people, activists, family members, etc., to triangulate findings. We included this slide mostly to show you how we conceptualized that, the big word disability, who are disabled people. We understood that different disability groups often have distinct identities with distinct disability organizations advocating for them. In the conceptual framework of independent living, of course, we understand that human rights are the same and applicable to all of them. But in order to understand their specific struggles and the barriers specific to their social inclusion, we thought that it's best to keep a balanced sample, and we did every effort to include proportionally roughly the same amount of people from every disability group so that their views and their lived experiences are represented. We also interviewed family members for children under 18 and for some adults who couldn't be interviewed with our chosen research method, that was live course interview, mostly done verbally with spoken words, but not only. I could also speak about this if someone is interested. We can share information about how we included non-verbal people in the sample. We identified 7 barriers to social exclusion in this live course interview sub-study. I will really speed up now because we have this paper available online in English, so those who are interested can read the full paper in the Scandinavian Journal of Disability Research that's available open access. These are the 7 main barriers to social exclusion. There can be other barriers as well. And before I forget, there are also 3 enabling factors that we identified. Those are informal support networks, so friends, family members, neighbors, allies who help people to overcome barriers, NGOs and DPOs, disabled people's organizations, and internet and mobile phones also help a great deal to people to speak with others and get support. So the first major barrier is inadequate social support. This is hardly surprising, I think, to most of you who are familiar with the field. We found that basically support services that enable people to live independently in the community are not available in large parts of the country. Where they are available, they are not always available. So for instance, due to specific provisions of Hungarian legislation, weekend hours and early morning or late evening or night hours are not covered by these services. Where services exist, they are full often, and waiting lists are long. The quality of services and the adequacy of services is really a big question. We found that even those people who receive these services are not happy with the content and the quality of the service they get. This means various different issues depending on the type of service they receive. Some of them called daycare centers, like bicycle parking lots, where people just dump their disabled family members and not much happens with them there during the day. And we also found that social cash benefits are very low, extremely low in some cases, and are very difficult to obtain. And so many people just don't know how to apply for those or how they could get another type of social benefit that they would be eligible for. We also found that healthcare is often inadequate for people with disabled people. One of the most prominent themes, Miro, I'm seeing your marks there. That was one of the most prominent themes in all interviews. All of us regularly go to doctors, and we rely on health services when we need one. We found that much of these contacts between disabled people and healthcare services in Hungary over the last 20 years were often working with serious shortcomings, with everyday microaggressions, unfriendly or even abusive staff, with lack of information about service, with lack of accessibility of health services. We had a number of examples from blind people with mobility problems, and others telling us how they found it so difficult to get to the service or get the appropriate service in a clinic or in a hospital due to inaccessible spaces and services. The quality of care is questionable. One of the reasons for this is that interviews mentioned was low wages across the healthcare system. So people are often forced out of state-funded healthcare service providers and go to private clinics where they must pay, even though they are insured by the state. They choose to get private services because that's what is available to them, or because that's what they hope will better serve their needs. We had one account from a person, from a non-verbal person, I think. No, that was somebody who after an accident had a spinal injury, and after the accident he had an operation performed on him, and he wasn't informed before or after the operation about his own condition. That is quite stunning if you think about it, given how many healthcare rights Hungarian citizens have on paper. The third barrier is labor market, exclusion from the labor market. That is, of course, crucial because employment provides us with the income that we need to maintain our everyday lives. We pay for housing, we pay for food, we pay for everything, mostly from the wages or salaries we get from employment. Well, we found, again, unsurprisingly, that many disabled people are not in employment. Those who are in employment, they are only employment in insecure jobs. So from time to time, they have a job, but those are for short periods of time. Those who are in permanent employment, or those who were in employment at the time of interviews, were mostly telling us about their low incomes. So the fact that someone is employed doesn't mean that they are not living in poverty or somewhere around the poverty threshold. We had highly qualified interviewees who worked way below their qualifications. And we also found the inadequacy of existing job search services. So those job centers that are available, state-run job centers available across the country, hardly help disabled people to find the work they need, or the employment that they can join. We also found inadequate accessibility and assistive technology. That is, I think that is something that is rarely mentioned in many human rights documents and policy reports, yet it appeared in the data set as one of the salient themes. So people sometimes just can't get out of their houses because their houses are the only spaces, basically, or their close neighborhoods where they move. And this is not because they don't want to go elsewhere, they don't want to go to the town center or city center, but this is because they don't have accessible transport, or they don't have accessible city centers, or they don't have accessible services that they could visit. So they rely often on someone else's help to get those services for them. Even though most interviewees who talked about this mentioned that they do see a gradual change and progressive changes in terms of, for example, accessible public transport in Hungary. That is, by the way, footnote, due to EU-funded investments into accessible buses or trams or tram stops, metro lines in big cities. But it's still not enough, especially for those who live in rural areas. The bottom quote, unfortunately, I didn't translate it, is from a person with an intellectual disability, a woman with an intellectual disability. The next barrier is poverty and housing problems. By this slide, you must sense that these barriers are absolutely intricately linked to one another. Of course, people live in poverty if they are not employed. Of course, they have housing problems if they can't pay for proper housing, especially in big cities like Budapest, where there's really a huge housing crisis, and only those with significant income can afford to buy or rent a flat. And this, of course, impacts how disabled people live and where they live. What we found, for instance, is that for those who require adjustments in their own houses, the state support for this, to make your own house accessible, for instance, after your health changes or you need to use a wheelchair, or after an accident or any kind of crisis, even just temporarily when you need some adjustments, that state support is so minuscule that people can't actually use it. When they use it, it's not enough. We also found that poverty forces people out of cities to rural areas, where they will see less and less chances to get employment, especially type of employment that provides enough income. And I think that's the last major barrier, that's limited decision-making in legal guardianship. That is one of the main themes, I think, of ENIL and many other DPOs in Europe and nationally. And it appeared in our interviews as well. We identified 3 typical themes among interviews. The first, that people who were under, people who were under guardianship, they were really unhappy about it. All the interviewees we spoke with, all of them, told us that that they didn't want to be under guardianship, and they wanted to gain their full independence legally back to be able to make decisions relevant to their lives. We also found that was from parents and family members, people who found that guardianship is an appropriate type of legal measure. Sometimes it's very much needed. But I would highlight that these were always parents or family members who framed guardianship as an appropriate legal category. And we also found a third theme that was everyday decision making. And here we saw that decision making by interviewees with a physical disability, mobility, or sensory impairments were more likely to be happening, whereas for people with higher support needs or people with an intellectual disability, it was much more common to live under guardianship. Sorry, the final barrier is stigma and prejudice. That was probably the most salient theme of all. This appeared in all the other themes very strongly. People experience stigma and prejudice and negative attitudes everywhere where they go, in the streets, in healthcare centers, social services, schools. Of course, there are also good experiences, but these really don't balance out all the negative experiences we had. I would give it back over to you, Agi, at this slide. We finished the live course interviews part here, and we will look deeper into policy issues.
Yeah, it's just to say that
we are running out of time.
Try to wrap it up in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I suggest then we skip this, Gabor, and then you move on to the more interesting findings from the media analysis and the survey.
Shall I? Okay, so the policy analysis is also published, and we are hoping to publish the paper out of that data set sometime this year in an English language journal. Media analysis. We sample data from the 24.hu website, which is always in the top 3 mainstream media outlets, news websites in the country. It is somewhat leftist centrist. We couldn't really find 1 or 2 that were balanced out. I don't think that nowadays we have so many websites that could be claimed as being in the center. But in any case, it is in the top 3, and we sampled 3 years of data. We identified almost 500 articles where disability as a theme, or disabled people, or issues related to disability appeared. And you see at the bottom of the slide a small table that I included for you to show that it's really uneven. When you break down data disaggregate data according to different disability groups, it's really worth looking at closer, because then it shows that some disability groups or some disability-related issues are more likely to appear in the mainstream media, for instance, whereas others and other disability groups remain really at the bottom and at the margins. We found the gist of this media analysis is that traditional and ableist framings are dominant. That's the sad reality. Despite all the human rights progress and despite all the DPOs and all the grassroots activists' work, when they appear in the media, journalism presents the cases mostly through a traditionally ableist individual tragedy lens, if you will. people with intellectual disabilities and autistic people are the least visible, and DPOs, disabled people's organizations, and their struggles for social justice, their messages, their press releases, their public statements, interviews they would like to give, these hardly feature in mainstream media in Hungary. The next slide is the public attitude survey that we did. That was a nationally representative sampling of 1,000 respondents. We based the questions on a disaggregation of different disability groups. First, we asked about general acceptance. That was a proximity method. Agi can add if I'm not clear enough. But we also asked about then about different rights, whether people approve of people's rights, for instance, to marry, to have children, to vote, etc. And results showed that there's a general support for all disability groups in the data. So the public seems to be having an attitude that is supportive in general towards disabled people. But when you look closer to specific rights and specific groups, then we see important differences. And one of these is that, again, autistic people and people with an intellectual disability seem to be the least supported by positive public attitudes. And some of the human rights that these people should, and all people should enjoy, namely voting rights, the right to marry and the right to have children, or the right to go to school together with all children, the support for this is significantly lower for people with an intellectual disability and autistic people. And here are the conclusions. Agi, I will give it back to you. I think you can sum it up better.
I think, can you continue? But it's really noisy.
Okay, it's very noisy. I think one issue that I would like to highlight goes back to the first slide where we started, why we did the whole research. And this is because we as disability researchers and advocates often feel that there's much noise about legal progress and changes and positive policy changes and new laws and amendments to existing laws, and how all the implementation of the CRPD is rolling out in different countries. And here I would like to ask you to try to frame this question not in the context of Hungary, but in your own country or internationally. I do think that what we found in this research is not specific to Hungary, but may be applicable to many different countries as well. And that is namely that there is a tension between the policy view and the legal view of legal progress, where, okay, there is progress with hiccups, but it's still progress, and the everyday reality of disabled people who go through these legal changes. And this tension, or this paradox, if you will, was one of the findings of our research, because we found that barriers were long-standing, and sometimes for decades, people were feeling that they were facing the same barriers, and those laws and those EU investments that happened in the country were hardly even mentioned, for instance, in live force interviews. We also found that barriers reinforce each other. So this is really important because we really should understand that we listed up seven of these barriers, but these have a compound effect that can seriously damage people over many years. You can see it on the slide how this can play out, and in various other alterations as well. I think that's the gist, really. Would you like to add anything, Agi? I think we are happy to answer questions later on.
Yeah, I wouldn't add anything, but we are happy to answer questions. Perhaps have a discussion at the end. I'm conscious of our allocated time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Agi and Gabor. It's a really rich research, and the picture is very dark that you paint, but it's realistic. So I completely agree that many of us, if not all of us, perhaps will identify what you're talking about, and particularly in the post-socialist region of Central and Eastern Europe, this issues kind of recur, and it feels like there is no progress, and particularly in recent years, it feels like there is a regression towards the darker, some darker ages. It's difficult to recognize any of the provisions of the convention implemented on the ground. I will leave the questions for the very end, because we are quite ahead with time, and give the word now to Miro, and then we will collect some questions at the end on both presentations. So we have Miro Griffiths from the University of Leeds, a disability researcher and disability advocate, and a good friend of the European Network on Independent Living and supporter, and part of the management of the organization as well. So Miro, without further ado, I give you the word now. Let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Theo. And apologies to Gabor for scribbling on his slide. I didn't realize they were public, so it's a good job I didn't do anything naughty or rude on those notes. But thank you. So I'll share my slides. This is when everything goes wrong, when I share the wrong screen. But hopefully, for those of you who can, you can see my slides and not my WhatsApp messages. So in this presentation, I wanted to talk about my recent project that I've been working on for the last 4 years, which is to do with disability activism across Europe. And with this presentation, I want to try and give you the headline findings, really. There has been several articles published on this, which they're all open access. You can find them if you Google my name. And there is a book coming out and a documentary film. But given I also want to make sure we have time for questions and reflections from both presentations, I'll just kind of go through and chart some of the key findings, which will hopefully spark some interest. I won't tell you who I am because Theo's already done that. In terms of the investigation, so this was a 4-year project looking at disability youth activism across Europe. And it was really to try and tap into the ideas around what constitutes disability activism from the perspectives of young disabled people in European states. What sort of participatory methods do young disabled people engage with in order to engage in resistance, engage in imaginings and creativities and experimentations of what we're trying to achieve through our activism, to think about the parameters of, say, accessibility and inclusivity, what the priorities, because of course within social movements, there is always a negotiation of prioritization of what you want to explore and consider. So I was thinking about participatory methods. I was thinking about barriers in relation to how what unnecessary restrictions are imposed upon young activists who want to engage either at local levels or macro levels or meso levels of engagement around activism and resistance. And then to think about that kind of future possibility as well of, what thoughts and considerations are emerging when we think about the future of disability activism, taking into account the immediacy of crisis that we are in many situations around the globe, around disabled people's and other marginalized communities' justice attempts, but also thinking about that long-term planning around the articulation of inclusivity and accessibility. So this was the sort of questions I tried to grapple with the investigation, and it culminated in 4 phases of a project. Firstly, there was a survey. It was around just over 200 participants in the survey, and this was to capture their ideas and challenges and experiences around their participation in social movements. Then I conducted 25 interviews with young disabled activists, going a little bit deeper, so moving towards a granular level of detail from the survey, which would allow us to kind of bring out specific experiences associated with activism life and thoughts and considerations about activist mobilizations. Then there was a bit of an element of arts-based practice, which is what I refer to as a future laboratory. This was done in collaboration with a good colleague of mine, Dr. Jade French. And this was as part of the Freedom Drive, and this was the last Freedom Drive, I should say. This was a workshop which asked young disabled people and young disabled activists to plot their thoughts about, well, what does constitute an accessible and inclusive societies? What things do we need to think about in relation to that? And again, I'll come back to some of those findings as we go through, as we try and kind of chart the headlines. But this was about producing through art, and that could be drawing or collage or through statements, a way of capturing different perspectives. And this produced a one-issue zine, which is available on the Disability Activism in Europe research website. And it was also now being collected by several archives, zine archives across the globe, in the UK, Europe, and the US, as a way to use as part of the engagement with young disabled activists in their own spaces. And finally, there was a production of a documentary film. So we did many interviews with young disabled activists to kind of capture that visual discussion and documentary recording of people's participation in activism, and to kind of bring out their key thoughts about where the state of activism now and where it's going in the future. The documentary film is in the editing phase, and should be released later in the year. So if anyone wants to do a screening of it, that'll be absolutely fine. You can get in touch with me on that sense. That's a nice little plug for you there. So in terms of findings, I'm going to talk about it in relation to these 5 areas. Firstly, thinking about the importance of activism, moving through to unnecessary restrictions that deny participation within activism. We'll think about improved participation, so what needs to happen in order to improve disabled people's participation within resistance and activism. We'll think about the actual resistance practices that are utilized, and not necessarily the parameters of barriers and improvements, but think about, well, what are young disabled activists drawn to in terms of practicing their resistance? And then we'll think about future possibilities as well. So when it came to importance, what was quite fascinating was this, and again, I can't go through all my findings because of limitations of time. So I'm just pulling out what I think is of interest for today. But of course, if people want to talk to me afterwards, they can do about more of the findings and so on. But what I thought was quite interesting here was there was an element of this simultaneous activity between defensive and progressive engagement. So as young disabled activists, they would often speak to me about how they had to negotiate depending on the context of their activism and depending on the emerging issues that they were facing within where they localized their activism, is this engagement between being quite reactive to the crisis that is occurring. So that may be in terms of responding to the brutality experienced by disabled people in a local area. It could be the premise of news stories that illustrate the vulnerability of disabled people's lives, and they're trying to respond to that through their engagement. But also this progressive engagement as well, which was orientated towards kind of articulating visions for possibilities and hope. So thinking about, well, not just responding to the immediate crisis and then being trapped in short-term crisis-driven agendas, but to think about the broader possibilities of what do we want to achieve through our activism. And that often then negotiated back to larger networks of activity, such as the European Network on Independent Living's youth network, or within their established DPOs, where there was this charting of activity and strategies and agendas which would move beyond the immediate crisis and think about the long-term gains and goals. Some of that aligned with existing policy and legislation. Some of that was more radical in terms of trying to establish change in political and economic arrangements and configurations. So this defensive and progressive engagement also illustrated what's referred to, particularly in Ellison's work, this temporary solidarities, where activists would have to think about where do they create solidarities with other activists, disabled activists, but also other social movements as well, and other activist networks, in order to establish action on a particular issue. So there was this constant negotiation of defensive, progressive, but also temporary solidarities and ending of networks in order to move on to explore other issues. There was also, I think, in terms of articulating the importance of activism, this focus on normality, and where does the premise of how disability is situated within their activism. And there was a key articulation that much of the activism had to be associated with resisting this invalidation of disabled people's bodies. So thinking about the ways in which there is a deficit of credibility about disabled people's voices, thinking about the confinement through incapacity, as Hughes talks, as a way to legitimize the exclusion of ourselves or our bodies from communities and societies. So young activists talked about having to engage with this issue of invalidation, of constantly trying to challenge this. And they did this through trying to situate their activism not as a deviation from normality. The disabled body is not a deviation from normality, but as a way of highlighting the difference per se. So the idea that there is varied experiences across human existence. There is various ways in which we engage with our bodies, or various ways in which we engage in our communities and through participation. And it does constitute difference, but it doesn't constitute difference in a way of saying it's an undesirable difference, rather than there is a recognition that there is constantly difference, and difference should be acknowledged and respected. And indeed, for some people, it should be celebrated. And trying to resist this idea of difference occurs, but it's a deviation from what is perceived as being normal. But I will come back to that, because this was slightly contested in thinking about the future of activism. Then we move on to issues of unnecessary restrictions. And when we think about unnecessary barriers being imposed upon young disabled activists, there was a kind of emphasis on this idea of youth. And I talked about this for many years. This was part of my doctoral PhD research as well in a UK context. But this dismissiveness around the youth perspective, and that occurred in two different ways. One was to dismiss the youth perspective entirely and say, well, as young disabled activists, we feel that our voices aren't heard. They aren't given validity or credibility by more established groups or more established members within activism. Or there was a dismissiveness by trapping the perspective in a particular way. And what I mean by that is young disabled activists would say they feel that their voice is trapped in only giving a youth perspective. So you're only valid when we need to call upon the youth narrative or the youth perspective. And there's a limitation or a restriction from being able to inform and influence the broader activities that should transcend the notions of youth borders. So what we categorize as being youth. Activists wanted to say, well, my views and my experiences and my ideas, they shouldn't just be articulated as youth perspective. They should be articulated as the premise of disabled people having a political consciousness about injustice and trying to offer suggestions for change. There was aspects of resource infrastructure and support infrastructure. Again, tying this back to Agnes and Gabor's presentation, that lack of support in order for people to have sufficient support to do what they want to do with their lives, but orientating that towards an activism focus, so being able to access support to engage with in their political participation or in their activism, because many activists didn't have the support even just to be able to move around their home, move around their localities, participate in things that they had to do or wanted to do, such as labor market or education and so on. Getting those basics was not possible. So even the idea of thinking about how to organize their support around activism was deeply problematic, and limited their participation. And finally, there was an issue of time and the notion of time constraints. Many activists felt that, young activists felt that they couldn't engage at the accelerated pace of many opportunities that are presented to activists, such as responding to activities, mobilizing for particular issues, influencing policy agendas, and so on, because the way in which it is organized on the basis of time meant that issues with health conditions or impairments restricted or denied ongoing opportunities. And this was particularly the case for people with learning disabilities, autistic people, and people with fluctuating conditions, because if they missed those windows of opportunity, they were then dismissed or relegated and assumed that they couldn't participate in ongoing projects and so on. So when we move to improved participation, so this was tapping into ideas about, well, what do we need to do to improve young disabled people's participation in activism? It came, for the purpose of today, I wanted to draw on three particular issues. One was this notion of intersectionality, and I've combined it with this notion of radical and incremental activism, which, so I'll explain that in a little bit with a bit more context. So the notion of intersectionality was a key theme throughout much of the discussions with young disabled people. They wanted to think about disability and justice. They wanted to think about the possibilities for inclusivity, and they wanted to do it in a way which engaged with their intersectional backgrounds, experiences, diversities. So it was a way of trying to move and challenge the normative constructs of their characteristics and identities, and think about what unique and nuanced experiences are born through that intersectional notion of and recognition of identities and backgrounds. And in thinking about the importance of intersectionality, it then became apparent that activists or operate on two different levels, really. One is the incremental activism, where there is, and I currently got a paper coming out on this, which was to do with how to engage in a way where you are perceiving your change to be incremental. It is, it is affecting specific steps in agendas and strategies and processes that can, again, be within traditional organizations, it can be within traditional forms of policy process and activism, or it could be in terms of community mobilization. But the aims and achievements that you want to get to through your activism, it's seen as, well, you can't do it all at once, and it can't be too radical. It has to be done in a way which is incrementally affecting change. Whereas other young disabled activists talked about the need for radicalism, the need for articulating a way of radical overhaul of particular arrangements as a way to respond to the crisis and the regression that people have spoken about, and Tia has just nodded to before, but also recognizing that through radical action, you can broaden your possibilities and what is desirable in the forms of accessibility and inclusivity. So for some, there was an orientation towards one space, and for others, there was a recognition of you have to kind of balance between the two. Then there was a kind of articulation of the way in which young disabled people wanted to orientate their focus on opening possibilities. And I've spoken about this in particular detail in one of my papers on heterotopian ideas within disability activism. So for young disabled people, they wanted to see their participation as a way of opening up possibilities to experiment with. And that might be networks, it may be projects that they want to work on, but they wanted to see their participation as a form of experimentation, of testing out ideas and possibilities associated with their interests.
Miro.
Sorry, Theo.
Can you try and wrap it up in a couple of minutes, please?
Sure. Okay, I will do. So in terms of resistance, there was well, I've spoken before about this kind of radical pursuit and this incremental change. what I think is quite interesting to highlight here is the notion of atomized and collective organization. So some activists, in talking about their resistance, they talked about it in very individualistic ways, where they talked about, they saw that their activism was primarily associated with their own individual pursuits and their own individual gains. They wanted to achieve something specific for themselves through their activism, whilst others talked about the need for collective organization, to rather than recognize the individual pursuits, the collective organization of forming networks, of trying to influence change that wasn't for themselves but for the broader disabled people's community was the element of their practices. So this kind of discussion between atomization and collectivism, I think, is quite interesting here. The last point on this slide, which I'll move on, I'll skip it, but just say that the notion of knowledge was also key as well. So thinking about how to utilize knowledge, maybe through archives, as a way to inform young disabled activists about historical and contemporary debates associated with disability politics. This was a key desirable aspect. So finally, when it came to the future, and this is where I'll finish on, when it came to the future, there was two things to talk about. Well, one is this the emergence of counter-alternative sites. So the notion that young disabled activists saw disability activism as a way of producing the counter-alternative to what is currently going on in society. So it wasn't necessarily a response to injustice. It was a way of opening up the alternative to illustrate and showcase and articulate what it is that is desirable, what is it that is possible within people's imaginations for inclusion and accessibility. They didn't want to see their participation as a way of responding to existing disability injustice. They wanted to talk about their participation as a way of producing the alternative imaginations. And key to this was going beyond disability. So the future of disability activism for many of the activists was being critical of this normativity of what we perceive as the normal, but it must be articulated in a way that goes beyond disability. Because for many activists, they said, if you start from the principles of accessibility and inclusion, and you talk about it for disabled people, it will have wide-reaching positive consequences for many other communities and for the ways in which we organize politically, economically, socially, culturally, when we think about aspects of accessibility. So the future of activism was not necessarily to talk about the specifics of disability, but to use disability as a lens for rethinking the possibilities of more desirable forms of social organization. And I think that raises a fascinating question about the future of activism. Does it remain talking about disability, or does it use disability as an example to think about the broader levels of injustice faced by our communities? Because the world in which we live in is clear from what we've talked about. It's an undesirable world for many people. And the question is well, what is possible when it comes to desirability of inclusivity and accessible social worlds? And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Miro. Brilliant. It's a kind of a site you provide with a site to look at for hope as a kind of a counter perspective on all the barriers that Gabor and Agnes were talking about at the beginning, and that are getting kind of more and more. So let's now have some discussion, and I have a question here in the Q&A box for Gabor and Agi from Ingrid Stam. Thank you so much. How did the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, play a role in your research process? And how do you feel you can use the CRPD, the convention, as you did separate it in different disability categories? Would there be a way to conduct the research without using the categories, do you think? So this is a question for you, Agnes and Gabor.
Would you like to go first answering that? This has come up a few times.
Okay, so I think our study was informed by the social model of disability. Firstly, that's why we looked at barriers. That's why we understood that the struggle of disabled people for social inclusion and equal rights is preceded by or hindered by barriers. Then the CRPD is being implemented in Hungary, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to look for structures and mechanisms of marginalization, because the implementation process is not going too well. In this regard, the CRPD also strongly informed our study. Many of the questions in questionnaires or during the interviews were prompted by provisions of the CRPD. So you remember the life course interviews, guardianship regimes versus supported decision-making, the right to accessibility, the right to services in the community, etc., are all provisions in the CRPD. And your question about the categories, Agi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we disaggregated the whole so-called united or one disability group into subcategories because we wanted to get better data, really. What happens often in these studies is that researchers just go for the low-hanging fruits. They have a limited time, limited resources. They need 50 people to fill out a questionnaire, so whoever who can fill it in. We did purposive sampling, so we went for those who are really hard to reach, and we really struggled to fill up some of those subcategories. For instance, autistic people were not very easy to get to speak with us in interviews. Non-verbal people, we had to invent a whole set of techniques and methods, how we would invite them to interview and how they can type their words instead of the oral communication I'm using now, but how we can still maintain an equal participation, respecting their rights, anonymity, etc. I think these broken down categories as per disability groups, which by the way follow largely relevant Hungarian legislation. These groups are really artificial, we know, in a way. People belong to one group but also to another group, etc. There's so many problems with these disability categories. We thought that using these would allow us to have richer data, more specific to specific needs of people that are unfulfilled. Aggie?
Yeah, absolutely. And the only thing I would add to that is that later when we analyzed the live story interviews, we did not separate those by disability group. We analyzed that as just one, together, really. So this was more just to ensure kind of representation. We did not talk about how we try to reach our participants, but these organizations are still very much organized by a disability group. But then we also try to make sure, and we involve. Yeah, that's a whole other story. But yeah, just wanted to make sure that we reach people who live in rural, remote areas as well. We didn't.
Thank you, Gabor and Agi. Yeah, sometimes in order to be inclusive, you need to categorize. It's kind of a paradox. The categories help us provide some special accommodations that are needed to become more inclusive, including in our research. Okay, so we have another question. I am conscious that we are ahead of time, but let's extend this for 10 more minutes if you can, please, because we have another question, and both presentations were so rich that they deserved the questions. So from Radoš Keravica, thank you for such an interesting presentations. I have a question for Miro. How do you think the atomization and individualization of young people's activism will influence what we consider a disability movement and the prospects for collective action for social change? So a question about individualizing activism and its impact on the movement.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question. I think it's something that activist networks will constantly need to negotiate and reflect on within their mobilizations, particularly because when talking to activists for the project, many talked about, you know, the initial motivation to participate was for having the personal informed knowledge of disability politics, rights and entitlements as a way to challenge the injustices that they personally experience. Then through that, they would become part of more broader collectives in their localities or online, and if there wasn't anything in their local spaces. And another activist talked about, you know, one of the primary reasons for their participation was because they wanted to develop skills that would allow them to then pursue opportunities in working in civil society organizations, working in policy processes, working at legislative levels, or trying to seek access to political spaces. So I think sometimes within social movement or mobilization, there is a kind of distrust or fearfulness around the atomization, but I think both can be recognized for their gains if done in a careful and considered way, where you think about the opportunities that are available for collective mobilization that does welcome perspectives and varied opportunities to participate, and is orientated towards resistance practices that are of interest to that cohort at that particular time. Because, you know, many activists again would talk about how, you know, there was priorities that they were not interested in, or there was practices that they didn't feel comfortable engaging with. If, you know, if they wanted to engage more in incremental activism, they didn't want to go to a protest, and vice versa. There was those who wanted to engage in inverted commas disobedience, but and felt that, you know, they would be bored or frustrated working on trying to establish a strategy for change, a charter for action, and so on. So it's about having these open possibilities of participation at the collective level that also recognizes the reciprocity or the reciprocal nature of participation. As an activist, what do you gain on a personal level for engaging in this process? Yes, you want the collective pursuit of liberation for our community, but there's also that desire of saying, well, actually, you know, if I'm putting resources, I'm putting energy in, I'm putting time and commitment, I'm moving away from other priorities, what can I show as a way of feeling valued and feeling that I've got something as part of this participation? So for me, it's the reciprocal arrangements that occur within activist mobilizations to say an individual can gain something from this knowledge, self-worth, opportunities, whilst also then engaging in the collective pursuit for social change.
Thank you. Wise words. Sometimes this oppositions can work in tandem and enhance each other. Particularly the opposition between the individual and the collective, as it applies to activism. Okay. Any last messages? I mean, if you again, Gabor, and you, Miro, if you could just summarize your presentations in one key message, what would it be that you want to leave us with? I know it's a difficult one, but let's finish with something kind of synthesized and powerful.
The word I'm thinking of is epistemological justice. I think listening to disabled people, what they have to tell us, and in a humble way, so allowing, you know, all the time and effort that needs to be put into a research project may bring out a different picture than the one existing in policy documents, you know, expert-driven research. And I think if there's one takeaway from our project is, for me, our own project is this: it's worth investing time and effort into going and speaking to disabled people. Yeah, this is an epistemological justice. That's a jargon word. That's, you know, how do we know what we know? How do we know the reality of Hungary's or Hungarian disabled people's struggles? Do we look at policy papers on websites of UN agencies, governments, universities, or do we listen to people? These are not oppositional things. These are not, I don't want to antagonize the two, pit them against each other, but that's just a footnote that I hope there will be more research coming out from more countries exploring lived realities in the light of policy progress.
Thank you. And Miro?
I think for me, it's this notion of the counter alternative. So, to perceive the mobilization of activists, and that includes young disabled activists, but it can include established members as well, as articulating not a response to the immediate crisis, but to offer the counter alternative to thinking about social world organization differently, that has much broad impact and legacy for many marginalized and dissatisfied communities. We can use the premise of disability and justice, and we can use the ideas of inclusion, accessibility, and participation that comes out of our individual and collective pursuits as a way to offer that alternative vision for the social world. And I think that's one that is much more desirable. And that's where our activism should be perceived not as a response to saying, well, how do you fix the immediate problem, but to offer that longer term articulation of hope and possibility.
Thank you, Miro. I see that we have one more question, and this will be the last one, and we'll finish from Richard Brunner, who asks about the importance of DPOs, disabled people's organizations, in creating change, in creating social change, in making policy change real. So just very briefly, the importance of DPOs. It links very well to your final messages. DPOs are very much linked to the issues of voice, the issues of epistemic justice, and the issues of providing counter spaces for alternative futures and alternative imaginaries.
Well, if I go first, so DPOs came up as a prominent issue. It came up as a way to facilitate knowledge and participation in activities. There was a desirability for activists to have more DPOs and coordinated networks, particularly in their localities, because often they would have to immediately make the jump to a national or international presence because there wasn't that support or infrastructure on the ground. So there was a recognition of DPOs, but there was also a recognition of wanting more at the local level of participation. The only other thing to add is that there was some frustration with established DPOs in the way in which they would park the youth perspective, and that goes back to my point about how some people would feel that their voices were trapped only in a youth narrative, and they felt that the DPO leadership needed to think more about how to welcome the varied perspectives of its members as a way to inform its activities. But we know that representation within our organizations matter, and it is the only legitimate way of being able to, going back to Gabor's point, capture the evidence of what we want to talk about, but also then frame it in a way which is about liberation.
Thanks, Miro. Gabor, Agnes?
Just Agi wanted to, I think, ask a question. I'm just not sure that everyone...
You're on mute, Agi.
No, that's okay. I think that's kind of now past. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with everything, and also to me, it's just a question of framing. But I'd be really interested in structures where these voices and the lived experiences are heard by policymakers and politicians. And all my question would have been: have you come across any good examples where youth activists felt that they were being heard? But to me, it's kind of linking everything together. It's not just the ones who have heard and kind of channeled into what is it. Sorry, Gabor.
Yeah. The question about influencing actually policy, about institutionalizing resistance, about creating kind of more organized forms of responding. I mean, we all know how good the Zuccotti Park mobilizations were. We are the 99%, but then what came out of it, perhaps some good messages without organizing, without institutionalizing, and going through all this pain of bureaucratizing and professionalizing. It's hard to actually influence the big politics out there, to influence the policy making. Okay. Miro, do you want to respond to this, or?
Well, I'm conscious of time, but I will just say briefly, there was a trend to say that where young civil activists felt most positive about their participation, it came particularly at local mobilization, where they could inform and influence then what is it that they wanted to achieve. They could think about it on that kind of trajectory of radical or incremental change, but they had a long ongoing presence then in that space, rather than sometimes the broader opportunities at national or international level, which would then become very compartmentalized and closed down. And then it was hard to have that kind of ongoing legacy. So they felt that there was more of that opportunity at a local level, and they wanted to see that replicated in their national and international bodies.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I could go on like this for hours. Unfortunately, we have to finish out of courtesy to our audience and to our plans as well. I just want to really thank Agnes, Gabor, and Miro for the brilliant, thought-provoking and sometimes disturbing, but we need this disturbance presentations. And I want to thank also our participants for the questions. And I want to thank Ino for making this thing possible, for hosting this event, for hosting the Independent Living Research Network. I hope we will continue with this, and I also want to thank Lily Angilva for helping organize this webinar. So thanks again. Again, watch this space. We will try to organize something for September or October, and next time we will allocate more time for the presentations and discussions. Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.